For hundreds of great shows like this one, go to onnetworks.com.
Play Value is brought to you by Xbox Live Marketplace.
Nintendo versus Sony. This rivalry tells us part of one of the most important stories in 20th century consumer electronics.
CD-ROMs were the big thing in the early 90s when it came to the home computer market. So too did the video game console makers start to get into the space and decide the next generation for them was the CD-ROM.
By 1992, Sega had the Sega CD, there was a TurboGrafx, and now Nintendo wanted to get into the game. Now, Sega CD peripheral was made by Sony, so Nintendo says, hey, we gotta get one of these too, we'll just get Sony to make it for us also.
But Nintendo started to get a little uneasy because Sony started to talk about in the future releasing their own game platform.
The bottom line here is, look, in order for you to develop something for the Nintendo, you're gonna have to know the inner workings of the Nintendo. And that's kind of an unfair advantage, seeing as how you now know the inner workings of the Sega, the inner workings of the Super Nintendo, and now you're gonna build your own? Based on all the info that you got from us? No, hold on.
So it all comes to a head at CES 1992. That's the Consumer Electronics Show where all these companies get together and show off their new wares.
Sony gets up and makes the big announcement that they're teaming up with Nintendo to manufacture a CD attachment for the Super NES, which is great. Everyone's really excited. Unfortunately for Sony, the next day, Nintendo gets up there and says, ignore what Sony was talking about. We're actually making the CD thing with Philips.
And Sony's left with their jaw dropping. They had no idea. Nintendo didn't tell Sony this. So Nintendo, when they get up on stage and make this announcement, this is a shock to Sony.
This really is pretty rude to not tell Sony that you're not going to be working with them anymore and just let them announce it anyway. They intentionally let them humiliate themselves.
That's public humiliation. That's shameful to them. Sony now has egg on their face.
Nintendo's used to kind of flicking off Sega and TurboGrafx 16. That's nothing to them. But Sony is Sony. It's a huge multi-gajillion-dollar company, and Nintendo might not have been ready for this fight.
Sony is going to take all of the information that they used in developing a CD attachment for Nintendo and release it as a standalone CD gaming system called the PlayStation.
Sony doesn't exactly know what they're doing in the games industry, but they recognize that they don't know what they're doing, and they have a lot of money.
They buy Psygnosis, a software company, make us some good games. They go and they buy the old Worlds of Wonder Salesforce, which made Atari a hit, which made Nintendo a hit, which will ultimately make Sony a hit.
So after Nintendo gives Sony the big middle finger and says, hey, Philips is gonna make our CD attachment, a year later in 93, the CD attachment hadn't come out. 94, no CD attachment. 95, still no CD attachment.
And at this point, there's Windows 95, which is a legit gaming platform. There's the Sega Saturn. Sega's all the way up to the Saturn. They're up to a 32-bit system, and Super Nintendo is still running off 16-bit cartridges.
There's no 32-bit Nintendo at this point. So what Nintendo does is they launched the N64, a 64-bit system.
Now, it's been 3 years since Sony got left at the altar for Philips. In the fall of 1995, Sony releases the PS1, and the rest, as they say, is history.
The PlayStation actually had a pretty good line of launch games for a console with no history. They didn't have a Mario or a Zelda to fall back on. They kind of had to start with scratch, and they did a pretty good job of it.
And the kicker of the PlayStation is that it played CDs. So you're not only getting a great gaming console, but it also plays music CDs.
This was so successful that Sony's tried this with each iteration of the PlayStation. The PlayStation 2 is a DVD player, when not everyone had a DVD player. The PlayStation 3 is the cheapest Blu-ray player on the market.
Meanwhile, Nintendo is still working on the N64. Delays. Takes a whole extra year for that thing to come out, so Nintendo is just stuck playing catch-up.
The 64 only launched with 2 games. Mario 64, which is of course a classic, and then Pilot Wings, which is kind of take it or leave it. 2 games though, that's it.
Now usually when a video game console comes out, it takes about a year before the good games really start rolling out for it. So when the PlayStation had its 1-year anniversary, they had games like Tomb Raider and Resident Evil.
So by the time Nintendo reaches that point and starts getting solid third-party titles like, I don't know, maybe you've heard of GoldenEye, Sony has already reached the next level. And they're releasing sequels to their classics that improve on the originals, like Tomb Raider 2, Resident Evil 2, Castlevania Symphony of the Night, just amazing, amazing games. No matter what happens, Sony's always gonna have that year head start on Nintendo.
Everyone's making games for it, and the reason why is it's on CD. It holds more, it's cooler, it's cheaper.
It's just a wildly different medium. There's trade-offs, you know, there's load time, but you can store hundreds of times more than you could before. Nintendo decided to stick with cartridges on Nintendo 64. They didn't go with CD-ROMs like everyone else was.
They insisted that games be cartridge-based. A, quicker load times. B, probably the more important reason, they're more difficult to pirate.
Cartridges do have some advantages over CDs, and it was never really obvious that Nintendo made the wrong choice until Square jumped ship and released Final Fantasy VII for the PlayStation.
So remember how Nintendo left Sony at the altar? Well, a couple of years later, all the chickens come home to roost. There's a company called Square, and they make the Final Fantasy games, which everyone knows are Nintendo games. Every Final Fantasy game comes out on a Nintendo system. And of course, the next Final Fantasy game is slated for the N64, and it's guaranteed to be a huge hit.
Square Enix, which had been developing a Final Fantasy game for what would be the Nintendo 64, bailed and actually came out with it as an exclusive for the Sony PlayStation.
So why did Square switch from Nintendo to Sony? One reason, the CD, that optical disc. You could store more stuff on there, more movies, more music, more graphics, and for Square to build the greatest Final Fantasy game to date with all the music and the full motion video intros and the 3D characters and the side quests, you needed that big CD to put all that stuff on.
Final Fantasy VII was the tipping point. It's such a big game that it really popularizes the entire genre of role-playing games in America. And Sony surged into #1, and they never looked back.
Over the next couple years, both Sony and Nintendo would release a whole lot of good games. Nintendo had Donkey Kong 64 and Zelda the Ocarina of Time. Sony had Silent Hill, and they had Metal Gear Solid. But when all the dust settled, Sony's got 100 million PlayStations out there, and Nintendo's got about 34 million N64s. Nintendo had lost the video game crown.
But believe it or not, things were about to get much worse for Nintendo.
So when Nintendo released its next console, the GameCube, it had to face off against two huge competitors. One, the PlayStation 2. Second, the Xbox. And it went from the #2 spot down to the #3 spot.
Nintendo, long in third place, got hungry and got creative, and they came up with the Wii, which is now the #1 console out there, showing you that anybody who's on the bottom doesn't stay there forever, and anyone who's on top also doesn't stay there forever.
This is what needed to happen for gaming. They were trying to compete on the grand scale. Now they're like gonna start relying on things like innovation and interaction as opposed to big titles, big games, big budgets. No, Nintendo's going back to their roots now and really focusing on gameplay and interaction with people. And that's what Nintendo does the best.
The lesson here is that competition's good for the industry. Sony and Nintendo were both going back and forth, forcing each other to release better products.
The truth is, we're the winners. Because right now, we get a lot of great games and a lot of great things are happening in gaming.
Rated E10 plus the T. Play the games everyone wants to play.
For hundreds of great shows like this one, go to onnetworks.com.